What's this tremendous crowd? What's going on? Is there a circus in town or something that everyone's gone to? Whoops, you don't want that. Grab the wrong piece of paper. I might have to go back to my office. Right. No. Yeah, that's a long file. Go back and get it.
You came to class last week, right? Yeah. They didn't cancel or anything like that?
I'll just go home.
No. Wait. There, is that your classmates from the other department? Are you used to seeing them? Huh?
No. I don't know what class this is.
I know there's people out there because I can hear them, but I can't see them. There's a person, one human being in the room. You forgot your laptop? Congratulations. Go get it. I won't cover, well, what I'm going to do the first 5 minutes is review what we did last time, so get on back in. I think last time we finished the War of 1812, we fought the Battle of New Orleans, so we're going to pick up after that. I also talked a little bit about what President Madison did before he left office, and we'll take a look at that again, just briefly. Maybe cement it in your mind a little bit. And then we're going to talk about Monroe and probably the Adams presidency as well. President Monroe served for 2 terms of office. Adams served for just 1 term. check something out on this, yep. Okay, just kind of reviewing. Treaty of Ghent's what ended the War of 1812. We talked about the peace negotiations, which involved, and that's a young, fairly nice-looking John Quincy Adams. There's pictures of him when he's really old and ugly too. I thought it'd be nice to him to put that picture up. We talked about the negotiations with the British. That's going to be an important thing because the British are still probably the world power, and we're going to have to get along with them one way or another. We're going to have to figure out a way to do that. We talked about the Hartford Convention too, I think in passing, did we not? The guys that wanted to secede from the Union because of the War of 1812 up in New England. That makes us look very, not have unity in our country, appear that we didn't have unity in our country, but as a result of the war and our victory in the war, there's this kind of period of good feelings. See if I can get that to come up on the screen for us. There you go. New nationalism. So President Madison, it also causes kind of a flip-flop. When you find it, remember the Democratic Republicans or the anti-federalists, kind of the same difference, tended not to want the federal government to spend any money, tended not to want the federal government to have its nose in any more than necessary, didn't like a big army because they didn't trust the army. Trying to think of other things they were against, and they wanted a really strict interpretation of the Constitution, and yet you start seeing the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans acting like the Federalists and the Federalists acting like the Democratic Republicans. Of course, the Federalist piece of the pie is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the country grows. Madison's in favor of a strong military, in favor of the national bank, even in favor of tariff protection. And generally speaking, anti-federalists don't like tariffs because it causes farmers to have to spend more money on imported goods. It causes the Westerners more expense. But suddenly, they see the need for that. And we're going to pass laws about that. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I have to talk about the fact that we also felt like we're now a world power of sorts. I'm not sure how powerful we thought we were, but we flexed our muscles a little bit right after the war. We're having trouble in the Mediterranean again from pirates, and these ones are coming out of Algiers. And the ruler of Algiers, well, they all go by different titles. It's our fault, not theirs. We translate their languages different ways, but some people use the word B-E-Y as being the man in charge. Some people use the word Pasha. Some people use the word D-E-Y. It all means the same thing. We're having a fight with the Dey of Algiers. And this time, we're going to send a pretty strong naval force into the Mediterranean. We're going to drop a few shots on the top of Algiers, and the Dey of Algiers is going to decide to be a little bit more friendly. We'll sign a treaty with them. This is one of the first times in our history where we seem to be leading the world in a way. Because as soon as we get done putting some muscle on the Dey of Algiers, the British copy us and the Dutch copy us and do the same thing. Poor Algiers is getting bombarded like nobody's business. And piracy is going to go out of business along the north coast of Africa. And we can say that we led the way. Our leader, naval leader up there was Stephen Decatur, the same young man that many years before had burned the USS Philadelphia to keep the people of Tripoli from using it against us. And then he fought in the War of 1812 and was quite successful. Now he leads this whole force up there as a Commodore, and he pounds the Dey of Algiers into submission. Our new legislation that's going to happen, most of it right in 1816, the same year as the next presidential election will happen. Madison's getting some things done before he leaves office. He passes a bill through Congress extending the charter of the National Bank. Since we're rechartering it, we're going to call it the Second National Bank. The First National Bank during the War of 1812 kind of fizzled away. We never renewed it. The Second National Bank will have a 20-year charter, which means if it's chartered in 1816, that charter should last until 1836. We'll be around to talk about the end of that charter. Funny, because as I said, there was a little bit of a flip-flop, and you've got the Democratic Republicans, the so-called anti-federalists, in favor of things like the National Bank. Remember back when they were having the fight about the first time that we had a national bank? Madison didn't want it, Jefferson didn't want it. Suddenly now the Democratic Republicans say, we want a national bank. Henry Clay supports it. Henry Clay of Kentucky. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina supports it. Clay, of course, had been the Speaker of the House. I don't know if he's Speaker of the House in 1816 or not. I think he still was. Eventually he's going to switch over to the Senate. He will serve as Secretary of State as well. We also, strangely enough, are able to pass a protective tariff through Congress. Of course, most of the people in New England are in favor of that because most of them are connected with industry. And most of the people in the South are against it. In this case, though, there's quite a few people in the South that support it. And the reason they support it is that after the War of 1812, the British start dumping goods on us. They've held back. You know, we're one of their biggest markets. So while we were fighting, we're not buying anything from them. And they've got a lot of stuff stacked up. And they want to get rid of it. So they sell it for next to nothing. And they're putting our factories out of business by doing that. Maybe they did it on purpose. So a lot of people that normally are against the tariffs start to support them for a while. And the first big one we passed is 1816. We're also going to do something that the anti-federalists didn't think that the federal government should be messing around with. We're going to start doing things like building roads, even building canals. We'll talk about canals a little bit later. One thing that Madison wouldn't do was let them take money from the newly chartered Second National Bank and use it to build these roads. They're going to get all the money to build the roads by selling land up in Ohio Territory. The election of 1816 is going to see James Monroe elected. He's the guy that during the War of 1812 was both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War for a while. So his name is well known. He's done a great deal of service for the country. James Monroe is also the last veteran of the American Revolution to be elected president. He'd been on the Virginia Assembly. He'd been in the Congress before we had the Constitution. He had served as governor of Virginia, I think a couple of times. I don't know if I have that on here or not. I guess not. Of course, he'd been Secretary of State and Secretary of War, been in the Senate, been our ambassador to Paris, London, Madrid. So he's an accomplished diplomat, an accomplished statesman. Let's look at an anomaly, or let's look at something that just happens. And that is, if you go through history, a lot of our secretaries of state and a lot of our vice presidents eventually become president. And, I mean, George Washington, his vice president, became president right after him, John Adams, and not long after that, his Secretary of State became president, Thomas Jefferson. In the case of John Adams, neither Pickering nor Marshall made president, but of course, Thomas Jefferson becomes president. In the case of Jefferson, neither one of his vice presidents are going to get to be president, but his Secretary of State, James Madison, will get elected president. In the case of Madison, neither one of his vice presidents will become president, but his Secretary of State, James Monroe, will get elected. That's a pattern that explains to you why so many people try to get the jobs like Secretary of State, and why so many people are willing to put up with what sometimes can be a really boring job as vice president, because some presidents don't use their vice presidents and they're kind of locked away in a broom closet unless the president dies. Nowadays, in modern times, you see more and more that presidents try to use their vice president. The current president trying to use his vice president because she can get him more votes when he wants bills passed in Congress. In fact, they're going through that process right now. James Monroe's vice president is more of a joke to me than a real statesman, but his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, will become president. So it's a pattern. Monroe's cabinet, Vice President D.D. Tompkins. You guys have probably already forgotten it, but back at the beginning of the War of 1812, a gentleman by the name of, not Schuyler, what was his name? Van Rensselaer was running to be governor of New York, and D.D. Tompkins told him, "You're not a man if you join the army." So Van Rensselaer joined the army, and D.D. Tompkins got to be governor of New York. He's that kind of a politician, you know. Good advice from my friends. John Quincy Adams, we know a lot about, we'll know more about. John C. Calhoun was a war hawk in Congress at the outset of the war. He'll become Secretary of War under Monroe. William Crawford, Secretary of the Treasury. Monroe invited Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to have a position in his cabinet, but Clay felt like he was a lot more powerful as the Speaker of the House, so he wouldn't go. It was probably a long-term mistake if he wanted to ever be president, because he never got known very well by the American public, just by the members of Congress. Okay, one of the things we're going to run into is the First Seminole War. Background on this. The Seminoles we now regard as a tribe in Florida. They're not really a tribe. They were a combination of escaped slaves, Creek Indians, and other people. They were called the Seminoles by the Spanish, and the name stuck. During the War of 1812, unbeknownst to us, or we'll discover it later, the British cut a deal with the Spanish. The Spanish were supposedly neutral in the War of 1812. The British cut a deal for the Spanish to allow them to go into Spanish territory down in Florida in that area. And British agents, or sometimes just British military units, will be down there providing weapons and things like that to the Indians to persuade them to go across the border and attack places in the U.S. I think Andrew Jackson figured that out during the war. When he went down and fought the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then went for a little bit further south, he spotted British involvement. He's always on the lookout for it. Now, after the War of 1812, he'll become the governor of the part of Louisiana that includes New Orleans and a little bit further north, that territory. And he's always on the lookout for the British. He's suspicious of them. Eventually, he persuades the president to give him permission to go after the Seminoles who keep attacking across the border. And the problem is that the Seminoles just run for the border every time someone threatens them, and then we can't go get them. Jackson gets permission to do something like what police nowadays would call hot pursuit. You can cross the border if you're chasing them from an incident. You can cross the border and catch them south of the border. Do not mess around with the Spanish. We don't want a war with Spain. Just get the Indians. The Spanish won't do anything about that. Here comes a little confusing piece of history. Andrew Jackson says, and I think this is probably true for sure, that he sent a private message to the President of the United States. And he says, Mr. President, I understand that politically you don't want to mess with the Spanish, but if you will discreetly give me the word, I'll do it anyway, and then you can claim you didn't tell me to. He said, I can get all of Florida. They don't have much in the way of military anywhere in the area. I can get all of Florida with no trouble. I've looked around, I've checked on it. So the president talks to his cabinet and they give him permission to do that. Here's where the controversy comes in. Andrew Jackson, for the rest of his life, insists that President Monroe gave a secret, personal, oral message to a congressman named Rhett, R-H-E-T-T, and told him, go down and tell Andrew Jackson, go ahead. Everybody else, including Monroe, denies it ever happened. Andrew Jackson will always insist that it happened. He goes south after the Seminoles. He also goes straight to Pensacola. He captures a Spanish fort there, a Spanish outpost there. Interestingly enough, there were British soldiers down there, and they faded away into the woodwork when he took the Spanish outpost. And I guess we're seeing sailing over the horizon. So Jackson's aware of that. In fact, on his way down into Florida, he captured two men at a trading post, ostensibly a trading post, and discovers after some research that they're both British Army officers and they're spies trying to persuade the Indians to attack the Americans. We're talking 1818 now. This isn't during the war. And as spies, he arrests them, tries them, I don't know what the trial looked like, convicts them of being spies, and what's the punishment for being a spy? It's a capital offense. Back then there was only one punishment for a spy. It was death. And he ran them up on a tree, he hung them both. Now they really were British, either officers or former officers. Britain flips out, they're upset. A lot of the American government's upset. The Secretary of War, who didn't know anything about any arrangement between Jackson and Monroe, writes a letter, which is a mistake, to the president telling him, this guy's a loose cannon, we got to put a leash on him or fire him or court-martial him or something for not following orders. The whole cabinet rises up against Andrew Jackson, except for one member of the cabinet, the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And he says, don't bother him. Leave him alone. Let him go. And his reasoning is, if he does anything that drives the Spanish to declaring war, we can say, we didn't tell him to do that. He's a loose cannon. We didn't intend for that. It's called plausible denial. It's how you can deny responsibility for something. As a spy or somebody like that, you always try and arrange plausible denial to protect yourself. At any rate, we'll never know the truth. Most historians don't think that Monroe ever sent Jackson a secret message. But he claims that Mr. Rhett brought him a letter. Anyway, John Quincy Adams doesn't mind that Jackson went down and took Pensacola and these different places. Why? He's going to have to negotiate with Spain. And with Jackson sitting on those places, he's negotiating from a position of power. But before he does that, who's the biggest enemy? Who are the people that we fear? We still fear the British. We're going to have to iron out some things with the British. And the first thing we're going to do is called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. It's about the Great Lakes. Remember what happened in the War of 1812? Oliver Hazard Perry wiped out their navy on the Great Lakes? So it was just us that had warships up there? We had some that were made in Britain. The British are very sensitive about that, and they feel that it's a threat to British Canada. And we say we don't want to pay for keeping the Navy up there anyway. So we agree with the British. It's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. It's named after the acting Secretary of State, acting on the instructions of John Quincy Adams. Why wasn't John Quincy Adams there? Because he was still our ambassador to Russia until the election was over, and he got appointed Secretary of State. So he's still on the way home. But he was able to send mail, give instructions. And what they do is they agree no warships on the Great Lakes from now on. That agreement's still in effect. Yes, the DEA has fairly large boats with automatic weapons on it. They didn't go up there until we made a deal with the Canadians that we needed to stop drug runners, and we would work together on it, because the law still exists that we're not allowed to put warships up there. That's the Rush-Bagot Agreement. It was concluded in 1818 and ratified pretty quickly by the Senate. Named after Richard Rush and Charles Bagot, who was the British ambassador to the U.S. Almost at the same time, we're busy negotiating another thing with the British. And that is, let's straighten out our border in between either, well, we can call it for our convenience Canada, but it was still British North America and the United States. And the border was really crooked. Let me see if I can find a crooked map for you. I don't have one on this. Well, you can kind of see it. It's really hard to see on this map if you're looking on your computer. After this agreement, and the agreement will be called the, can you guys see it? No, you can't see it on there. There's little dotty lines right here. Because part of British Canada stuck down into American territory, and part of the United States stuck up into what you would probably consider to be Canadian territory. So they agreed just to draw a straight line. We gave up a fair hunk of land that way, but we didn't mind. We wanted the border settled. So it goes from the west side of a lake. It's, I don't know, about 100 miles west of the Great Lakes, called Lake of the Woods. And it's going to go along the 49th parallel, 49 degrees north, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Why doesn't it go past the Rocky Mountains? Let's take a look at that map. On the other side of the Rocky Mountains is a territory called the Oregon Country. It goes from about 42 degrees north up to 54 degrees 40 minutes north. 3 countries were interested in that. On this map it says claimed by the United States and Great Britain, but there was one more country that was claiming it. Anybody guess who it was? What other country? You don't ever think of it when you're looking at this kind of a map of the United States. But that country is really close to the Oregon Territory. No, they're part of Britain then, so Yeah, they are claiming it, but another country. All you have to do is you go up to Alaska and you go across the Bering Strait and you're in that country. What's on the other side of the Bering Strait? Map 101. Russia. Russia's right on the other side. And they're down there, their fur traders are down there in what is now the U.S. state of Washington, all through that area. That's what the British were there for, mainly fur. The Hudson Bay Company owned a lot of concessions there. They had trading posts there. So did the Americans. People like John Jacob Astor had a trading post up there, all for fur. They're making millions off of it. We'll settle that problem later. So the line up to now is 49 degrees north. East of the Great Lakes, it's all mixed up. We'll talk about that later too. That's the Anglo-American Convention of 1818. So we've got Rush-Bagot, Anglo-American Convention with Britain. Now John Quincy Adams goes to Spain to negotiate with the foreign minister of Spain. I was just trying to read to get his correct full name. His name is Luis de Onís González Barra. We'll just call him Minister Onís. And they're going to negotiate separation between Spanish territory and American territory. Who's sitting in Spanish territory down there right now? 1818?
Jackson.
Jackson. Haha. Now you understand why John Quincy Adams didn't mind Jackson being down there. It gave us a great deal of leverage. And the Spanish are busy with other things. They're having trouble in south of that border because there's independence movements. They're having trouble in South America because there's independence movements. And they know that if we wanted it, we could take it by force because Jackson's already sitting in part of Florida. So they give us everything we ask for. And basically, we call that, see if I can find it here, the Adams-Onís line. The treaty's called the Transcontinental Treaty, but it's the Adams-Onís line. It looks like a stairway that kind of goes across where Texas is. Goes up the Sabine River, west along the Red River, then up to the Arkansas River, and it goes all the way along the Arkansas River up to its headwaters. There's a town called Leadville up there now. Silver mine city. It's kind of neat. It's all tourists. There's no mines left. And that's 42 degrees north latitude. They're going to draw a straight line from there all the way to the Pacific. And the Spanish are going to say everything below that line, below the Adams-Onís line, is still Spanish territory. We have no claims to anything else. So we no longer have a problem with how far north they claim from Florida or any of that because we own it all. Great success. Great success for John Quincy Adams. So we've settled our differences with Spain for the time being. We've at least acted with Britain in a civilized manner, although they're not our good buddies. We're still suspicious of them. That's a pretty good conduct of foreign affairs. Domestically, we're going to have a problem. Now, by the way, we're approaching the end of Monroe's first 4 years when we have a giant crash in our economy. Here's the story. Maybe you could understand a story like this because it happens to everyone individually and nationally. We were making lots of money because Europe had destroyed themselves and fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. So we were selling them food, we were selling them raw materials, the money was just rolling in. And the people who were making this money in agriculture and all that, since they had all this, there's a characteristic, a human trait. You might recognize it in yourself, you might deny it, but it's really there. And that is, if I'm making lots of money, I don't mind borrowing lots of money too. You know, it's, I got a lot, I want more kind of thing. And so a lot of these people who are making all that money, they borrowed money from the bank to go out and buy more land. The farmers wanted more farming land, but a lot of it was land speculation, where you buy a big hunk of land and sit on it until somebody wants to pay you a real decent price for it. But then Europe didn't need our food anymore. They had been fighting for several years. Their economies were getting balanced. And so suddenly the value of our farm products went way down. Cotton, which the South totally depended on, but also grains and things like that. So there's a chain reaction. The farmers are overextended, so they can't pay the local banks. The local banks are overextended, and they start going broke, so they can't pay the national bank. So the national bank starts to wobble. Not only that, but apparently in the national bank, there are some loan officers and people like that that have been taking bribes to loan money to people. And the national bank was overextended. And it becomes apparent after an investigation. And the president offers the president of the national bank the opportunity to resign, which he does very quickly. And he calls on a fellow from South Carolina that he met at the beginning of the War of 1812, because he was a war hawk, by the name of Langdon Cheves. He goes into the bank, he fires a bunch of people, he starts making it harder for the bank to loan money out to the smaller banks. Realize that just like the Fed, it's not really a bank, but just like the Fed, the national bank only loaned money to other banks, not to people. And they insisted that if any smaller bank wanted to borrow money from the national bank, they had to have a certain percentage of the money they had on the books liquid. What do I mean if you say liquid? When you talk about the liquidity of a bank or a business, how much actual cash on hand they have. Because a bank's business is loaning money out. So all the money you deposit, they lend to people. Then they make money on the interest. Of course, right now there's not much interest. And they don't give you any. I haven't had interest from a bank 5, 6 years. Before, you could get pretty good interest, 3%, 6%. But anyway, Cheves is going to straighten all of that out. The other thing on this list of domestic policies is the Missouri Compromise. Let's look at that. See all that purple unorganized territory? The arrow's kind of running through the words. That was all that we, basically most of what we bought from in the Louisiana Purchase. In about 1819, the territory that we actually call Missouri as a formal territory, much smaller piece of that big asked to become a state. They've done all the things that they're required to do to request permission to enter as a state. It goes through the House of Representatives. Everyone says that sounds good to us. One representative, though, where is he? One representative, though, makes a suggestion, and he passes a bill through Congress, through the House of Representatives. His name is James Tallmadge. And Representative Tallmadge is from New York, and he suggests in all of these new territories that we're going to start forming states from, let's all agree there will be no slavery there. And even in Missouri territory, where we know there's slaves there now, but let's require the Missouri gradually emancipate them all. Gradually free them all. Doesn't have to be in one day, but over a period of time. That goes through the House of Representatives, because by now, the majority of our population is up north. Tend to be anti-slave. But when he gets to the Senate, it's a brick wall. Why? because every state has the same number of votes in the Senate, and there is an even balance between pro-slave states and anti-slave states. And neither side wants the other side to get 2 more senators, because it will upset the balance and give them an advantage. Henry Clay comes forward with an idea. He's back in Congress. Henry Clay suggests a compromise. Henry Clay will be called in later years, probably after he was dead, the Great Compromiser. He was also, historians have also voted, I don't know what historians, but I read that historians voted that he was one of the 3 or 4 most significant congressmen in our history. Never got elected president, tried a couple of times. Henry Clay has an idea. The people up in Maine want to become a state. It keeps looking like Massachusetts or somebody's going to grab hold of them. They want to become a state in their own right. So Henry Clay says, let's let them come in as a free state, and then Missouri can be a slave state, and we're still balanced. The southern states say, okay. The northern states say, wait a minute, Missouri sticks way up pretty far north. Why should they be a slave state? So Henry Clay adds another part to this compromise. We will draw, after Missouri becomes a state, it can enter as a slave state, but after that we will draw a line from east to west and say above that line, no slavery is permitted. Below that line, slavery is permitted. And the line they drew was 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. It's a little funny because it's the southern border of the slave state of Missouri. But that's how the compromise worked out. Remember that. So now I've thrown, 3 latitudes at you. 49 degrees in between Canada and the U.S., 42 degrees between American and Spanish territory on the West Coast, even though the West Coast wasn't really under our control yet, and 36-30 about slavery, about the Missouri Compromise. That's all you need to remember about it. I mean, you can remember whatever you want. But while we're going on, let's talk about the Supreme Court for a minute. Guess who's still alive? John Marshall is still running the court. There are 3 court cases I want you to remember. Just remember what they decided. Dartmouth College versus Woodard. It's a lawsuit caused by the fact that Massachusetts wants to take over Dartmouth College and make it a state institution. They go as far as setting up a new Board of Regents, telling the Chancellor of Dartmouth College he's got to report to this new Board of Regents. But the other people at Dartmouth College say we don't want to be a state institution, we're a private institution. And it goes through the courts, it makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court asserts the sanctity of private contracts. What the Supreme Court says is, this college was formed as a result of an agreement. It's a contract. Now the state can't come along after the fact and make a law that voids that contract. That's a principle you call ex post facto. You can't make a law about something that's already happened. Daniel Webster was the lawyer that won that case. He's a brilliant trial lawyer, did a lot of cases in front of the Supreme Court. He had some personal failings, but he was a brilliant trial lawyer. The next case I'd like you to remember is McCulloch versus Maryland. That's kind of a fun case. In this case, Maryland convicts the president of the branch of the national bank that's in Maryland of tax evasion. What they have done is they kind of resent the national bank. and they collect tax on all their state banks, and they demand that the national bank also pay that tax. And the president of that branch of the national bank says, I'm not paying tax, I'm not subject to you, I'm a federal institution. So they convict him of tax evasion. It gets up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court cites the necessary and proper clause. We've talked about it once before. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress shall have the power, blah, 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 to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the duties of the federal government as outlined in the Constitution. And they add in their finding, in case you don't understand this from the Constitution, federal law trumps state law. That's already part of our Constitution. So, there's two precedents that they're not really established, brand new, but they're underlined. And a lot of court cases in modern times quote this trial. The last one is about transportation. Anybody in here a trucker? Nobody in here got a trucker. You guys are too young. I was a trucker for a while. That's one of my other things that I did after I retired. They put forth, the court ruling is that Congress has the sole right to regulate interstate commerce. What it is, one guy has got a license from the state of New York that gives him the exclusive right to operate a steamship inside New York waters. Another guy establishes a route that goes all the way down the coast, and he gets a permit from the federal government. And the guy with the exclusive right from New York sues and says, you're violating my rights, the rights that I purchased, my monopoly or whatever. And the Supreme Court says, no, no, no. If this is going to involve in any way interstate commerce, you can't interfere with it, with the state law. Which causes me to wonder about a problem we're having right now. We can't get our Christmas presents and everything because they say we don't have enough truck drivers to transport everything. That's not really the truth. We have plenty of truck drivers, but the state of California won't allow certain kinds of trucks to come into the state, and they won't allow non-union drivers to come into the shipyards. So they, in fact, are interfering with interstate commerce, and no one in the news has ever mentioned it. You have to ask yourself why no one in the news has ever mentioned it. And it starts to make you wonder about our journalists all over again. Because it's right there, glaring fact. California is the only state I know that also inspects your car when you go into the state, because they don't allow you to bring certain kinds of fruit and all that in the state. They've got away with that for years. They even ask you, if you've ever been there and driven there, they ask you if you have any fresh sandwiches or anything. They want to make sure you don't bring any tomatoes into the state. They're worried about bugs, I guess. Probably a reasonable fear, but nevertheless, they're interfering with interstate commerce, which is contrary to the Constitution. Monroe goes into his second term of office, and I'm not going to put that up. I'm going to take that down, and we'll just talk about it. Here's the deal. We talked about the economy over in Europe after the war. It caused us some problems. But in general, Europe really suffered during the Napoleonic Wars. A lot of destruction, massive loss of life. The European powers after the war get together, they settle the war up in Versailles at the end of the war. But they're still worried about somebody coming up and being another Napoleon. They're worried about one of the countries in Europe getting more powerful than the other countries and causing trouble. So a lot of them sit down, they don't want any more war. They form a group called the Concert of Europe. It's kind of informal. It includes Spain, France, Austria, Prussia and Russia. The British are kind of on the sides of it. Something that, you know, you and I talk about Britain. Where is it? What continent it's on? Europe, right? But it isn't. It's an island. And so a lot of the continental Europeans consider Britain to be outside of their little group. Britain's always trying to get inside it, except just recently they dropped out of the European Union. So they're going back to being an island. At any rate, they're worried about, because of the Napoleonic Revolution and kings being killed and things like that, they're worried about guaranteeing that the rulers of these different countries maintain their power. They're worried about getting a superpower in Europe again. They want to have balance of power. And they want whatever one country has, other countries have as well, as far as rights, territorial rights and things like that. But something else is happening also. And we mentioned it a minute ago, I think, and that is one country is starting to lose its colonies. By this time, they've already lost Mexico, and there are revolutions going on in South America, and by the late 1830s, they won't have anything left but Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Remember what I told you about the buzzards sitting up in the trees looking at the brand new America? Now the buzzards are up in the trees looking at their buddy, who's getting weaker and weaker day by day, and they're thinking, they might not be able to defend those colonies, but we probably could. And the British, they have their own ambitions in the Caribbean and even in the Pacific. And they don't like the thought of the Europeans, the continental Europeans, getting a foothold, another foothold in the Americas. We, of course, are uncomfortable with that. We want to expand our country all the way across to the Pacific. We don't want competition. And the British approach us, and they say to us, hello, brother, our fellow English-speaking country, our good buddies. That's kind of a stretch, isn't it? Why don't we combine our foreign policies and we'll keep the Europeans out of the Americas? We. Of course, who does that give a foothold in the Americas? Our cabinet thought, here's big country, big money, big army, big navy. That would save us a lot of money. Let the British do the fighting for us. One man in the cabinet, only one, says, no, open your eyes. What's going on here? His name was John Quincy Adams, and he was right. He draws a picture. I think there's a cartoon of it somewhere from a newspaper. It's a picture of a big warship with a line out from the back end of it, towing along a little rowboat, which is bouncing against the big waves in the ocean. Point being, who do you think the big ship is, and who do you think a little boat is? And do you really want to be subject to the guidance of the British in your foreign policy? Do you really want to perpetually be a second-rate state? And he explained it so well to the cabinet that they shifted their point of view. And they responded to the British, thanks, but no thanks. And in 1823, when he's making his annual speech to Congress, we now call that the State of the Union speech, President Monroe makes an announcement. Tell me, you know what the State of the Union speech is. Who's the audience? Yeah, it's kind of a trick question, but give me an answer. Who do you think it is? I mean, who's sitting there in the room to start with? Both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court's there, the military leaders are there. So is that the real audience? No. The real audience is the entire world. Believe me, even back then, and especially now, every year when the President of the United States makes his State of the Union address, the whole world is listening. So when he makes this little speech, he knows he's got an audience. All the ambassadors from the different European countries are sitting up there in the balcony, taking notes. And he delivers what he calls the Monroe Doctrine. Believe me when I tell you that Monroe wasn't a stupid man, but the man that really probably wrote that was John Quincy Adams. He probably showed him point by point what to say. Most historians give Adams credit for that. 4 points in the Monroe Doctrine. The very first one, there should be no new European colonies anywhere in the Americas. Point number 2, Britain should not try to introduce, or not Britain, the European world should not try to introduce their kind of politics into the Americas. We're talking about both continents and everything in between. In exchange for that, point number 3, we promise we won't interfere with colonies that already exist. Point number 4, we don't want your politics, we won't throw our politics in your face. Relatively an inoffensive declaration, but basically he's saying America for the Americans. We don't need the Europeans. We hear about the Monroe Doctrine in the news several times every year about one issue or another. Very important foreign policy statement. And as I said, probably contrived by John Quincy Adams. And he knew what he was talking about. And that brings us to the end of Monroe's 2 terms of office. Actually, the election will be in 1824. There's the Monroe Doctrine. I'll put it up so you guys can see it. Come on, Sheen. There you go. Got it memorized? Next slide. The election of 1824. Really, really interesting. Who wants to be president? First of all, we only have one political party that survived. Federalists are gone. All we've got is the Democratic Republicans. Everybody's a disciple of Thomas Jefferson, even if they don't agree with everything he said. John Quincy Adams wants to be president. He's a New Englander. He's a convertee. You know, he came over to the Democratic Republicans from the Federalists when Washington announced neutrality, because a lot of the Federalists didn't like that idea. He actually wrote a letter to Washington supporting him in that position. Washington actually used quotes straight out of Adams' letter in one of his speeches. William Crawford of Georgia, a good old-fashioned states' rights guy. He wasn't middle of the road at all, you know, against big government, against the federal government getting its nose in anything. Didn't like the National Bank, strangely enough. He's the Secretary of the Treasury under Monroe. Henry Clay of Kentucky, one-time Speaker of the House, one-time negotiator with the British to end the War of 1812. He's a senator. He has his own system called the American system. I'll explain that in a minute. John C. Calhoun, he wanted to be president too, and then he looked around at all these other candidates and he said, this is not going to be easy. And he noticed no one had decided to run for vice president. So he says, I'll run for vice president. And he got the position unopposed. And he throws his support behind the fourth guy that wants to be president, Andrew Jackson, who runs on, well, he actually doesn't run on anything other than he's a hero. He doesn't brag about being a hero, but all the American people know him. He's one of those guys, people flock around him wherever he goes. They want to touch him, shake his hand, whatever. He avoids talking about any political issues because he knows whatever he says, it's going to make somebody mad. So just don't say anything. Just say, hi, I'm Andrew Jackson. The vote. Jackson gets, let's talk about popular votes here. I got popular votes in here. Jackson gets the most popular votes. No question. Come on, where is it? Oh, don't tell me it's not in there. Jackson, I can't remember how many, he gets like 150,000 popular votes. John Adams gets right around 100,000. Crawford and Clay both get somewhere in the vicinity of 27,000, something like that. But Jackson gets 99 electoral votes. Adams gets 84 electoral votes. Crawford 41. Clay 37. Who won the election? It's another trick question. Who won the election? It's going to be in your exam, too. Nobody. Why? In order to win the election outright, you would have needed 131 electoral votes, that's half of the votes, plus one. To win an electoral election vote, you have to have one more than half of the votes available. So it goes to the Congress. Now, another rule is, when it goes to the Congress, that only the top 3 vote getters are considered. Anybody with fewer votes is out of it. That eliminates Henry Clay. Henry Clay is he's not popular in America because he's not that well known, but he is extremely powerful inside the Congress. Now he's not a candidate anymore, so he also throws his support to another candidate. He does not like Andrew Jackson, so he throws his support to John Quincy Adams. And he does one of those whispering campaigns. One of his lines was, just because you killed 2,500 British soldiers doesn't mean you're qualified to be president. Don't forget he was a loose cannon down south, et cetera, et cetera. John Quincy Adams wins in Congress. They pick him, which was their right. That's what the Constitution says. So he becomes the president. Right after he becomes president, he says, Henry Clay, how would you like to be Secretary of State? Henry Clay said, okay. And Andrew Jackson says, see, that's Judas taking the 13 silver coins. Right there. This was a corrupt bargain. And I would argue with that and say, this is a political deal. That's how politics work. Now we have a president who believes in Henry Clay's American system. Not all of it, but most of it. Henry Clay's American system believed in 3 things. Protective tariffs, so that our industry could grow. Federally financed internal improvements, roads, bridges, whatever. And a national bank. John Quincy Adams' policy, called the Adams Policy, supported federal improvements, it supported national bank, it was a little wishy-washy on whether or not we should have tariffs. When he comes into office, He's not very popular with the people that voted for Andrew Jackson. Remember, Andrew Jackson got the largest popular vote. That's going to give John Quincy Adams issues. He's going to suggest a lot of scientific things and really smart things, and Congress will keep giving him the thumbs down. He tried to do a standardized system of measures. Eventually we're going to do that. He's way ahead of the curve on that. He wants a national university. That gets shot down. He wants to build the Naval Academy. That gets shot down. He did get some stuff done. We'll go back and look at that slide in a minute. Congress approved roads, building of canals. We'll talk about canals later. Eventually building railroads, improvements in river navigation, further construction of the National Road, the Cumberland Road. While he was president, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was begun, which became a very important highway for moving goods. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal was done. The Louisville and Portland Canal is done. The Great Lakes are connected to the Ohio River by a canal system. He's going to build a canal through the Dismal Swamp in North Carolina. They'll even build the very first passenger railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. It's not a very long railroad, but it will become. A lot of them were done privately, but they were done with the help of the federal government one way or another. So you have to give John Quincy Adams credit for that. The other thing about him, well, this slide has his background. 6th President of the United States, great diplomat. He shifted from being a Federalist to a Democratic Republican. During his presidency, we're actually going to have real political parties start to grow. Up until that point, everybody that was in high office was a Democratic Republican. But they don't see eye to eye on anything, especially about John Quincy Adams getting elected instead of Andrew Jackson. So the pro-Quincy Adams faction, which included, at least for a while, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and people like that, they will start being called the National Republicans and not the Democratic Republicans. The pro-Andrew Jackson group will start dropping off the word Republican and start calling themselves the Democrats. They're going to start forming more like a real party, chairman and things like that, all the while that John Quincy Adams is president. One of the things that I didn't mention that John Quincy Adams really supported was the abolition of slavery. The louder he got about that, the fewer votes he got from the South, of course. May explain what happened to him in 1828 rather. He wanted us to be independent of other countries in foreign policy, self-determination. We weren't going to go out and make colonies anywhere. We weren't going to intervene in anybody else's problems. We're going to maintain freedom of the seas, freedom of commerce. And he did all those things. He also, by the way, predicted the Civil War. He knew what he was talking about. He wasn't a real good politician. He didn't even like hanging around Washington. He liked going back up to Quincy. He didn't organize his next political campaign very well at all. He still wasn't used to political parties. You see, way back then, candidates didn't go out and campaign on their own. People did it for him. And he was satisfied with that. The Jackson side of things in 1828, they are a well-organized political machine by the time of the election. There's another little side thing that we have to talk about because it's going to be a big problem. John C. Calhoun outsmarted himself really badly. He'd been kind of a nationalist, then he started getting more and more to states' rights. He wanted to make sure that John Quincy Adams couldn't get elected. So he and Daniel Webster, who defected from the John Quincy Adams group. Daniel Webster had his little thing about whoever paid the most money got his support kind of thing. They get together and they cook up a really smart idea. What they're going to do is they're going to write a tariff bill with an ungodly high tariff that's so bad, and they're going to add some things that the North doesn't want to add to it. It's going to be so bad that the president's going to be forced to veto it. And they figure if he's forced to veto it, he's going to lose votes from his power base, from the pro-tariff North. In the fight, he's also going to lose votes from the minority in the South that want to have tariffs. Senator John Randolph smells a rat and he gets away from these guys. Martin Van Buren, who was involved in the original idea, decides, maybe not. I think I'm going to get away from this a little bit when it goes bang. They passed the bill. The South calls it the Tariff of Abominations. They passed the bill. They put it on the president's desk. They're standing there with smiles on their face, waiting for him to veto it, and thereby destroy himself as president. But see, if he signs it, it's going to hurt him. If he doesn't sign it, if he vetoes it, it's going to hurt him too. And he looks at the bill, and he says, I don't think this is a very good bill, but what the heck, it's the will of the Congress. Who am I to veto it? He signs it into law. Oops. John C. Calhoun was in on this. Guess what? John C. Calhoun state, of all the states, hates tariffs more than anybody. So he jumps on his horse. That's figurative. I don't know if he went by horse or carriage or what. He sneaks down. He's the Vice President of the United States, right? He sneaks down to South Carolina. He writes the South Carolina, write this down, the South Carolina Exposition, that's E-X-P-O-S-I-T-I-O-N, and protest. And in this, he asserts the right of the state of South Carolina to nullify the tariff law. Told you that word was going to come back and bite somebody. He wrote it anonymously. I don't know how many people realized he wrote it. And it wasn't necessary to get Andrew Jackson elected, because by this time, Andrew Jackson's party has got the votes lined up. Jackson gets elected. John C. Calhoun gets reelected as vice president. The second man to be vice president under two presidents. He was under Adams and under Jackson. At this point, they're friends, kind of. Jackson's a little bit uncomfortable with John C. Calhoun. But Andrew Jackson is going to begin to have troubles almost immediately the day he walks into the White House. By the way, when he got elected, they had a wild party, and he had a lot of backwoods friends, and they were swinging from the chandeliers. They trashed the inside of the White House. And a lot of people were bringing this to Washington. We'll talk about that after I talk next time about the Industrial Revolution and some other social developments that have been going on all along from the late 1790s up through the War of 1812 and onward. We'll talk about that next time. You've got a set of notes that I put in. Only you guys have got it so far. I'll have to put it in for other people. It's actually intended for Unit 8, but it has the PowerPoint on the Industrial Revolution. And that's what I'll use next time. That's the reason I put it in for you guys, so you had it, so you could follow along. If you brought your computer with you. Everybody caught up with their quizzes and all that? I think all the quizzes are open still. Some people, I don't know about this class, some people haven't submitted their little question ones for their essays. Please do that. Gradually, I'm going through all of them and writing comments on them. Read that little thing that I printed for you guys on how to do the analytical essay or things not to do in it. I put it in your notes and reading. I think there's about 7 things that I said, don't do this. Number 1, most important, it wasn't number 1 on the list. A book on history is not a novel. Don't call it a novel. I think you're supposed to learn that about the 6th grade, but apparently our English teachers are not doing a good job. Maybe they're busy trying to just get the students to behave. You guys are all a bunch of rowdies, aren't you? Okay. Have a nice week, the rest of it.